Now, in particular, I remember you said that death is psychologically just as important as birth, and like it, it's an integral part of life. But surely it can't be like birth if it's an end, can it?
Yes, if it's an end. And there we are not quite certain about this end. Because, you know, there are these peculiar faculties of the psyche that it isn't entirely confined to space and time. You can have dreams or visions of the future. You can see round corners and such things. Only ignorance deny these facts.
All right, so Jung might imply here that death is not the end, because if he says that death is just as psychologically important as birth, that can only be true if death is truly not the end, right? I was kind of interested that he doesn't choose to say why death is as important as birth to explain to the interviewer. But then again, if you watch the rest of this video, he kind of does. He ends up saying simply, we do not know if there's life after death, but we do have this innate desire and even expectation of something beyond death. But even more intriguing is his use of salt as a symbol. He uses that later in this interview. He says, and salt to Jung is an incredibly important symbol, one of the most powerful and important symbols that represented to him an archetype. And the way he uses it in this interview is either a Freudian slip or absolutely brilliant. And I tend to lean to the latter when it comes to Jung. So let's go ahead and listen to the rest of the video.
It's quite evident that they do exist and have existed always. Now these facts show that the psyche, in part at least, is not dependent upon these confinements. And then what? When the psyche is not under that obligation to live in time and space alone, and obviously it doesn't, then to that extent the psyche is not submitted to those laws. And that means a practical continuation of life, of a sort of psychical existence beyond time and space.
Do you yourself believe that death is probably the end, or do you believe that?
Well, I can't say. You see, the word belief is a difficult thing for me. I don't believe. I must have a reason for a certain hypothesis. Either I know a thing, and when I know it, I don't need to believe it. If I don't allow myself, for instance, to believe a thing just for the sake of believing it. I can't believe it. But when there are sufficient reasons for a certain hypothesis, I shall accept these reasons, naturally, and should say, we have to reckon with the possibility of so-and-so, you know.
Well, now, you've told us that we should regard death as being a goal,
yes,
and that to shrink away from it is to evade life and
yes,
life purposes.
Yes.
What advice would you give to people in their later life to enable them to do this, when most of them must in fact believe that death is the end of everything?
Well, you see, I have treated many old people, and it's quite interesting to watch what the unconscious is doing with the fact that it is apparently threatened with a complete end. It disregards it. Life behaves as if it were going on. And so I think it is better for old people to live on, to look forward to the next day, as if he had to spend centuries. And then he lives properly. But when he is afraid, when he doesn't look forward and he looks back, he petrifies, he gets stiff and he dies before his time. But when he is living on, looking forward to the great adventure that is ahead, then he lives. And that is about what the unconscious is intending to do. Of course, it's quite obvious that we are all going to die, and this is the sad finale of everything. But nevertheless, there is something in us that doesn't believe it, apparently. But this is merely a fact, a psychological fact. Doesn't mean to me that it proves something. It is simply so. For instance, I may not know why we need salt, but we prefer to eat salt too, because you feel better. And so when you think in a certain way, you may feel considerably better. And I think if you think along the lines of nature, then you think properly.
Wow. So if you think along the lines of nature, then you think properly. So in other words, if you think the natural way, right, the way that humans have always thought since day one, that is to think that we live on after death somehow, that makes us feel better. In the same way that salt makes us feel better, because it's good for us. And I don't think he's saying that we're being comforted by a necessary liar or something like this. I think he's saying we don't know, but the unconscious assumes that life goes on. And the psyche isn't bound by time and space like our bodies are. That's kind of an interesting thing to throw in there. I can't prove anything. And he also says, I can't believe something that I've never seen or experienced that I can't prove scientifically. But you kind of have to go with the natural flow of things and believe in the transcendent and the eternal and in our capacity to live on after death if you want to be psychologically healthy. But the more intriguing thing here to me is his use of salt. He uses salt here to demonstrate how our bodies desire the things that they need, like salt, in the same way that the psyche desires the things that it needs, like a belief in the afterlife, like belief in the logos, let's say, in divine love. We actually need these things. And that may be the only reason he uses salt here, just as a somewhat random metaphor. But Jung did so much research, and he spent so much of his life studying this idea of salt, this symbol of salt, and the archetype that it represented to him. I mean, he spent so much time studying these myths, religions, philosophy, scriptures, alchemy, especially within the context of salt. But yeah, anyways, the archetype that it represented to him was Eros. He says, no doubt the reader will be conscious, as I am, of how uncommonly difficult it is to give an account of salt and its ubiquitous connections. It represents the feminine principle of Eros, which brings everything into relationship in an almost perfect way. Right? In other words, it is like the logos. It's a joiner of the opposites. It works together with the logos. It is the feminine side of the masculine logos. It does the same thing. It joins the opposites together. He also says, confirmation of our interpretation of salt as Eros is found in the fact that the bitterness is the origin of the colors. We have only to look at the drawings and paintings of patients who supplement their analysis by active imagination to see that colors are feeling values. That's a whole different can of worms that we're not going to go into right now, but it's interesting. He also says in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Eros might well be the quintessence of divinity itself. In other words, Eros is the most perfect example of divinity. And that's precisely what he's talking about when he uses this symbol of salt. And what's even more interesting is if you dive into the scriptural analysis of salt, hermeneutics, whatever you want to call it, it's basically the same thing. I mean, they're very similar, let's put it that way. They're not exactly the same. Jung's idea of what salt represented from an alchemical perspective and from all the other research that he did aligns very well with what most Christian theologians, or at least the good ones, believe that salt represented. Yeah, there's some difference, but let's go ahead and bridge the gap between Jung's interpretation of the symbol of salt and the scriptures. In Matthew 5, Christ teaches his followers, and these are the people that he's given his spirit to, the good news as well, the gospel, the kingdom of heaven, which is the kingdom of love, perfect love, essentially. It has come in this Geist, this pneuma, this spirit. And you access it through the Logos, through the Christ. He's telling them how to live in the world now as people embodying the Logos, people who are essentially living, breathing, walking Ark of the Covenants, right? They are literally little Christs. They are logoi, right? The little Christs. This is what they would later be called. Christian, that is what it means. And he says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by people. So why does he use salt here? Christ uses salt here for the same reason that Jung does, I believe. To Jung, salt is divine love in the form of eros, the feminine counterpart to the masculine logos, the Christ. The salt represents to Christ these little Christs, these logoi, the carriers of the pneuma, of the spirit, of ultimately love, right? Because God is love. These carriers of the spirit of love, Christ calls the salt of the earth. There are other scriptures that Jung quotes as well. He talks about in Mark 9:50, have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another, with another. And in Colossians 4:16, let your speech be always with grace and seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man. Now, here's a little bit more context from an ancient perspective. If you put yourself in the shoes of these ancient followers, what's really interesting is that you pretty quickly and easily understand why Christ uses salt here. Salt had the following uses in ancient times. Of course, it was used as a flavoring and as a preservative, but perhaps even more importantly was its use within the context of agriculture. It was used as an essential mineral that they would sow into the soil so that it could produce more and healthier fruit and vegetables. But they would also sow it into the ground in excess where they wanted nothing to grow. Salt in excess, of course, is death, basically, right? That's why you have the Dead Sea, for example, where they got their salt from much of the time. They used this salt to kill weeds and unwanted plants within the context, again, of agriculture. So when Christ tells his little logoi, the believers, the embodiers of his spirit of divine love, that they are the salt of the earth, he's essentially saying that they're the salt to the soil of the earth. He sows these vessels of love into the world with an end goal in mind, which is fruit. The fruit of life, abundance, the kingdom of heaven, etc. And of course, from the preservation side of that, they're also preserving God's values and bringing a unique and better flavor to society as a whole. But most importantly, they are love, agents of love, of the Logos. And when Jung says, we don't know why we need salt, but when we eat it, we feel better, I believe he's saying there are things that we naturally desire. Things like salt, like divine love, and the eternal. We can't prove that it exists, but we can see it, and we can see the need for it, and understand, perhaps, to a degree, why we need it. So don't think that death is the end. Think of it as a new beginning. In the same way that the earth needs the salt of divine love shining through human vessels, the psyche needs the eternal Logos. And in the same way that the body needs salt, the psyche needs the afterlife, needs a belief in something more. Jung seems to be saying, in the same way that the body desires salt because it needs it, our psyche desires the eternal, the pattern of death and rebirth, the belief in the afterlife, because it needs it. And while Jung points out we can't prove that death is only the beginning, he says it's just as important as birth, and even that death should be our goal, which is fascinating to say the least. Jung implies that we desire life after death, which brings to mind the argument from desire, which is something like, if you're really hungry, that means there's a such thing as food. If you're really thirsty, that means there's a such thing as water. Every deep desire we have points to something that can fulfill it. We don't have natural desires without any means of satisfaction. C.S. Lewis said, "If I find myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." So the idea is, if you feel a strong desire inside you for something more than anything the material world can give, like perfect love or the eternal or God, life after death, etc., that means there must be something that can fulfill that desire. So many people believe that something is God, and that the somewhere is what some would call the afterlife. And that's the gist of the argument. Now, I'm not saying Jung was pointing to all of that, but he seems like he might have been hinting at a little more than he let on, especially using such a loaded symbol as the symbol of salt. But what do you think? Is he speaking in riddles or parables here? Or is he speaking plainly, literally? Nothing to read into. By the way, Jung split from Freud's mechanistic causal model of psychic reality by arguing that psychic energy, libido, is finalistic. That is, it flows through the psyche towards a telos, a purpose or reason. But does Jung's telos have anything to do with the telos of the teleological argument? And does his desire for the eternal or the afterlife point to something like C.S. Lewis's argument from desire? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And there you have it.